The handcuffs were cold against her wrists. Amara Okonkwo stood in the center of Sunshine Heart's Daycare, surrounded by police officers whose faces showed no mercy, only the hard certainty of judgment already passed. Around her, the colorful walls she had painted herself, walls covered in dancing giraffes and smiling suns, seemed to mock the darkness of this moment. Children's voices, usually filled with laughter, now trembled with confusion as parents rushed in to collect them, their eyes avoiding hers as if innocence could be contagious in reverse. She had been a teacher here for 6 years, had wiped tears and tied shoelaces, and sung lullabies in 3 languages, had been the first person many of these children ran to each morning. Now she was being led out in handcuffs, accused of the unthinkable. 4-year-old Zara Bello was missing, and Amara was the last person to see her. That was enough. Inspector Odajimi read her rights in a monotone voice, his words blending into the chaos of Mrs. Funmilayo Bello's theatrical sobbing, her designer sunglasses doing little to hide the performance of grief she wore like a second skin. "She took my daughter. That woman took my baby," Mrs. Bello shrieked, pointing at Amara with a perfectly manicured finger. The television cameras had already arrived. Somehow they always did, when the rich demanded attention. Amara opened her mouth to speak, to explain, to plead, but the words died when she saw the looks on the faces around her. She had already been tried. She had already been convicted. The police van door slammed shut, and through the small window, Amara caught a glimpse of her grandmother standing at the edge of the crowd, one weathered hand pressed to her chest, the other reaching toward her granddaughter, as if she could pull her back through sheer force of love. What Amara did not know was that a black Mercedes had been parked 3 blocks away, and inside it, a man sat frozen, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. Chike Adeleke was not supposed to be here. He had a board meeting in 30 minutes, had investors waiting, had an empire that demanded his constant attention. But he had come anyway, drawn by the same invisible thread that had pulled him to this neighborhood dozens of times over the past 2 years. He watched through tinted windows as the woman he loved, though she did not know it, had never known it, was taken away like a criminal, and something inside him that had been carefully controlled for decades finally broke. Chiki had first seen Amara 3 years ago at a government hospital where his younger sister had been rushed after a car accident. The place had been chaos, overcrowded and understaffed, and his sister had been terrified, crying in a hallway because there were no beds available. Amara had been there visiting a neighbor's child, and she had stopped, had sat with his sister for 2 hours, holding her hand, singing softly, telling her stories until the doctors finally came. She had asked for nothing, had refused the money he tried to give her, had simply smiled and said, "We take care of each other." That is what it means to be human. He had never forgotten. He had found her weeks later, learned where she worked, and had begun to watch over her from a distance, anonymously funding the daycare through his foundation, ensuring her grandmother's medical bills were paid through intermediaries, protecting her in the only way he knew how, which was from the shadows. He had told himself it was enough, that she deserved someone simpler, someone whose hands were not stained with the compromises that came with building empires. But now, watching her taken away for a crime he knew in his bones she could never commit, Chiki realized that silence was not protection. Silence was cowardice. He reached for his phone with hands that had signed billion-naira deals without trembling, but now shook with purpose. The interrogation room smelled of old coffee and desperation. Amara sat in a metal chair bolted to the floor, her hands now free of handcuffs, but feeling heavier than ever. Inspector Odajimi sat across from her, his face professionally neutral, a recording device blinking red between them. He asked his questions in a flat tone. Where were you between 2 and 4 p.m.? Why did your car leave the premises? Why was there a deposit of 500,000 naira in your account 3 days ago? Each question was a small blade, cutting not her skin, but her spirit. She answered truthfully, her voice steady despite the fear coiled in her stomach. Yes, she had left briefly. Another child had an asthma attack, and she had rushed to the pharmacy for an emergency inhaler. The pharmacy's cameras would show her. The receipt was in her purse. The money. She had no idea where it came from, assumed it was an error, had even called the bank, but they said it was an anonymous donation. Inspector Odajimi made notes, his pen scratching across paper, with a sound that felt like judgment being recorded. Then came the harder questions. You work with wealthy families' children. You earn 30,000 naira a month. Your grandmother needs surgery that costs 2 million. Some might say you had motive. Amara felt tears prick her eyes. Some might say many things, Inspector. But I am not some. I am Amara Okonkwo. And I do not steal children. I love them. I protect them. But she could see in his eyes that what she knew about herself mattered less than what the evidence suggested, and the evidence painted a picture that even she had to admit looked dark. Outside that interrogation room, the story was spreading like wildfire. Social media had already convicted her. Poor teacher kidnaps rich child, screamed the headlines. Amara's photograph was shared thousands of times, each share adding comments that ranged from sympathy to vitriol. Mrs. Funmilayo Bello gave interviews from her mansion, performing her grief with practiced skill, her voice breaking at precisely the right moments. Zara loved that woman, Mrs. Bello said, her voice a whisper that microphones amplified into accusation. She trusted her. We all did. And now my baby is gone. And all I can think is that she saw how much we had and wanted to hurt me. It was a masterful performance, made more powerful, because buried within the lies was a grain of truth. Zara had loved Amara, perhaps more than she loved her own mother, and that love had been the seed of Mrs. Bello's hatred all along. In her mansion, after the cameras left, Mrs. Bello sat alone in Zara's room, surrounded by expensive toys that had rarely been played with, and felt nothing but cold satisfaction. She had not expected it to escalate this far, had not planned for national news, but she was not sorry. Amara had been too beloved, too perfect, and now she would pay for the crime of being good. 48 hours after Amara's arrest, Chike Adeleke walked into the police station like a storm given human form. He was dressed simply, but power emanated from him in waves that made officers straighten instinctively. He had spent 2 days doing what he did best, gathering information, building a case, finding the truth that others had been too lazy or too biased to seek. He had hired 3 private investigators, had called in favors from telecommunications contacts, had personally reviewed security footage from every camera within a 2-mile radius of the daycare. Now, he stood before Inspector Odajimi and laid out his evidence with surgical precision. Mrs. Bello's phone records show 17 calls to her ex-husband on the day Zara went missing, including 3 calls in the hour before she reported the child gone. Strange, considering she claimed they were not in contact. He slid a folder across the desk. Furthermore, security footage from a shop near the daycare shows Mrs. Bello's personal driver leaving the area at 2:47 p.m. with what appears to be a child-sized bundle wrapped in a blanket. The same driver who allegedly had the day off. Another folder. And GPS records from the driver's phone show he drove directly to an apartment in Lekki Phase 1, registered to a shell company owned by Mrs. Bellow's ex-husband. Inspector Odajimi looked up, and for the first time, doubt flickered across his face. "You're saying, I am saying that Mrs. Funmilayo Bello staged her own daughter's kidnapping to frame an innocent woman she hated, while manipulating her divorce proceedings. I am saying that Zara Bello is likely in that apartment right now. And I am saying that if you do not act immediately, I will go to every news station and tell them that the Lagos Police Department was more interested in convicting a poor woman than finding a missing child." Within an hour, a team was assembled, and Chiki insisted on going with them. The apartment in Lekki Phase 1 was the kind of place that existed in the gaps between legal documents, a space rented under false names for purposes that couldn't survive daylight. When police broke down the door, they found Zara Bello sitting on a couch, watching cartoons with the volume turned low. Her small face confused, but not terrified, because she had been told this was a game, a secret adventure. The ex-husband, Tunde Bello, was in the kitchen, and the look on his face, when he saw the police, told the entire story without a word being spoken. Zara saw the police and began to cry, not from fear, but from confusion. And then she said the words that would be played in every courtroom. "I want Teacher Amara. Where is Auntie Amara?" Cheek knelt beside her and spoke gently. "Auntie Amara is safe, and she misses you very much." The child nodded, clutching a stuffed elephant that Amara had given her months ago, and Chika felt his throat tighten with emotion he had not permitted himself to feel in years. Mrs. Funmilayo Bello's arrest was nothing like Amara's had been. There were no cameras this time. When officers arrived at her mansion, she was preparing for another interview where she would weep for her missing daughter. The look on her face when Inspector Odajimi read her rights was not shock, but calculation, her mind already working through legal strategies. "This is ridiculous," she said sharply, the grief performance abandoned. "You cannot prove anything." "But we can," Inspector Odajimi said, his voice tired. "Your daughter was found in an apartment rented by your ex-husband. She was delivered there by your driver, who has already confessed. Your phone records show coordination. Your own daughter, when asked who told her she was going on an adventure, said, 'Mommy said it was a surprise.' Mrs. Bello, you staged a kidnapping to frame an innocent woman. That is not something money can make disappear." For a moment her mask cracked, and what showed beneath was not remorse, but rage. "She took my daughter's love from me," Mrs. Bello whispered. And there, finally, was truth. Zara looked at that woman, the way she should have looked at me. Every day I saw it. My own child loved a stranger more than her own mother. As she was led out in handcuffs, past the chandeliers and marble, and all the expensive things that had never made her happy, Mrs. Bello finally understood what her bitterness had cost her. The day Amara was released, the sky over Lagos was perfect blue, as if nature itself was celebrating justice restored. She walked out into a crowd that had gathered, not the hostile mob that had watched her arrested, but her students' parents holding signs that said, "We believe Amara," market women singing hymns, former students with flowers. And standing slightly apart, as if uncertain of his welcome, was Chiki Adeleke, his eyes finding hers with an expression that held more words than he could speak. Amara walked toward her grandmother first, who had been brought from the hospital in a wheelchair, and they held each other while the crowd gave them space. Then Amara looked at Chike, and in his face she saw something she had never noticed before. He had carried her in his heart for years, had protected her from distances she never knew needed protection. "It was you," she said. "Not a question, but recognition. The donations. My grandmother's bills. The money that almost destroyed me. He nodded, shame and hope warring in his expression. I should have told you. I should have trusted that you would not think me foolish for loving you from a distance. Amara's eyes filled with tears, but not of anger. You saved me. When everyone else saw guilt, you saw truth. When the world walked away, you stayed. That is not foolish. That is love. They did not kiss or embrace with movie passion. Instead, Cheeky extended his hand, and Amara took it, and in that simple gesture was a promise of beginnings, of trust being built, rather than assumed. The courtroom where Mrs. Bello faced judgment was packed. The judge, Justice Adebayo, showed no patience for elaborate excuses. The evidence was overwhelming: phone records, testimony, security footage, and most damning, a recording of Mrs. Bello discussing how to teach that daycare teacher a lesson. When asked if she had anything to say, Mrs. Bello turned to Amara in the gallery. You think being good is enough. But I gave that child everything money could buy, and she still preferred you. You took what was mine. Justice Adebayo's gavel struck like thunder. Mrs. Bello, you did not lose your daughter's love to Miss Okonkwo. You lost it to your own coldness. You confused providing with loving. Rather than examine your failures, you attempted to destroy an innocent woman's life and traumatized your own child. This court finds you guilty. I sentenced you to 8 years in federal prison. She turned to Amara. Miss Okonkwo, on behalf of this court, I apologize for the injustice you suffered. I hope your example of grace under persecution will remind us all what true character looks like. As Mrs. Bello was led away still protesting, Zara was brought out, and seeing Amara, broke free and ran to her with unself-conscious joy. Amara caught her, held her, and over the child's head, her eyes met cheeks with shared understanding. Some storms clear the air, and what grows after is stronger for having survived. 6 months passed like a river finding its course. Sunshine Hearts Daycare reopened, transformed and expanded by Chike's foundation into a facility serving 200 children, with scholarships for struggling families, modern equipment, and a garden where children learn to grow vegetables. Amara stood at the entrance on opening day, watching parents drop off their children with trust restored. She had wanted to name it after herself, but insisted instead on Mama Ikin's Center for Children's Wellness, honoring the grandmother who had taught her that dignity was found not in what you owned, but in how you treated those who could offer nothing in return. Zara was enrolled there, her custody given to her father, who had emerged genuinely changed. The child still called Amara auntie, still ran to her each morning, but the desperation was gone, replaced by natural affection of a child with many sources of love. Chike came too, not as a benefactor, but as a volunteer, reading to children on Tuesdays, helping maintain the garden on weekends. He and Amara were not yet lovers, not yet officially together, but they were becoming something more foundational. Friends who had seen each other in crisis and chosen repeatedly to show up. On a Saturday evening, as the sun set over Lagos, painting the sky in impossible colors, Amara and Chike sat in the garden, their backs against the building wall, watching the last light fade. They had spent the afternoon planting tomatoes with 8-year-olds, and dirt still stained their clothes. Chike spoke first, his voice carrying vulnerability. I built an empire, believing power and money could protect me from hurt. But watching you arrested, knowing you were suffering, and that my silence had contributed, that broke something in me. Or maybe fixed something. Amara was quiet, then took his hand, their fingers intertwining with ease. My grandmother used to tell me that we are all walking each other home. We are all lost sometimes, and found sometimes, And the measure of a person is not whether they stumble, but whether they help others rise. You could have stayed silent, stayed safe, but you stood, and you fought, and you used everything you had built to serve truth. That is not a man who needs fixing, Chaiki. That is a man who was always good, but had forgotten how to show it. He turned to her, his eyes holding the dying sun's light, a question in his face he was too afraid to voice. She smiled, reading it anyway. Yes, we can try, not quickly, not with assumptions about where this leads, but we can walk together and see where the path goes. And there, with dirt on their hands and evening birds singing, they sat in comfortable silence, two people learning that love was not about grand gestures or dramatic rescues. Love was about showing up, about seeing truly, about standing firm when storms raged, and having the courage to be known. The ancestors taught us that a lie can travel halfway around the world, while truth is still putting on its shoes. But truth, when it finally walks, wears boots of iron, and all lies scatter like dust before its march. Amara Okonkwo had learned this lesson in fire and darkness, had felt the weight of those iron boots before understanding they were preparing ground for her rising. On the wall of Mama Akine Center, in the entrance where every parent and child would see it, hung words Amara had chosen. We teach children to stand. We teach them that goodness is not weakness, that truth is not foolishness, that love sees beyond surface to soul. And we teach them that even when the whole world looks away, there is a light inside each of us that no lie can extinguish. That light is who we are. That light is why we rise. Years passed, and the center expanded to 5 locations, then to other cities, becoming a model for education that prioritized character alongside academics. Amara became a voice in national conversations about justice reform, speaking from lived experience with the moral authority of someone who had survived the system's worst failures and chosen to fix it rather than flee it. Chike discovered his empire found its greatest purpose not in profit, but in creating opportunities for others to rise, to build, to transform struggle into strength. Together they raised Zara, alongside their own 3 daughters, who came in time, children who grew up knowing their mother's story, understanding that goodness was a choice requiring courage, that truth was a shield that sometimes felt heavy, but never failed those who carried it faithfully. And on difficult days, when the work seemed overwhelming, Amara would return to that first daycare building and stand in the room where she had been arrested. She would remember the coldness of handcuffs, the weight of accusation, the darkness of that cell. And then she would remember Chico, walking into the police station with evidence and conviction. Remember the children's voices saying, "We believe, Teacher Amara." Remember the moment truth finally marched forward and scattered every lie. She would remember, and she would know with certainty that only comes from surviving your own breaking, that the universe does keep accounts, that goodness does matter, that love, real love, the kind that acts rather than merely speaks, is the most powerful force in the world. This is how transformation happens. This is how truth marches. This is how love wins. Not loudly, not quickly, but steadily, certainly, inevitably, like sunrise following the longest night, like seeds breaking through concrete, like a teacher's influence spreading through lives. She touches until the whole world is brighter, kinder, more just. Remember this, when you are tempted to believe that goodness is weakness, that truth is foolish, that love without power is pointless. Remember Amara Okonkwo, who had nothing but her character and found that character was everything. Remember that the truest measure of a society is not its buildings or wealth, but how it treats those with no power to demand better treatment. Never forget, Life always rewards the pure in heart. The truth will always defend the innocent. And love, patient and brave and utterly unstoppable, always finds a way to win.